Hello, this is Dr. Davies, and as I noted in the email I sent out, or the announcement I posted, we won't have our inquiry class on January 20th. I actually got us through more information on January 13th than I had intended, and I have an off-campus meeting on the 20th as well, so this works out, so our next class will be on the 27th. So instead, I also have this lecture that I would have given, and that way I can just do this online. You can watch it, and there'll be a short quiz about it, and we'll be set. That way you can do it on your own time, and I will see you next on the 27th. Please remember to have your assignment number 1, article review, due January 26th. Please be sure to put that on D2L, so we'll be all ready on the 27th to review those articles and to talk about this lecture that I'm going to give you right now. So the lecture is how do we do an empirical research? And we do empirical research in all the sciences, and basically empirical just means observed or experienced. So it's some kind of science, some kind of study where we observe something. It's commonly used some kind of research that can be basically disproved or tested. As you may know, we rarely prove something to be the case. We're more likely to disprove it. So the more studies we have that seem to not disprove something shows or indicates that there's support for some theory or for some hypothesis. So again, we do this in all kinds of sciences. I am a social scientist, and I'm going to take you through how we do this in some social science. But you can apply a lot of this to natural science as well. So think about how this term, your groups, that we'll get into eventually, could test the Sapir-Whorf or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis as you listen to and read this lecture, and especially if you can tie it to something to do with heroes like I did on the first day of class. So there's kind of two types of research you could think about, largely throwing all research into these two piles, deductive and inductive. Deductive is when we go general to specific. Inductive is when we go specific to general. Basically, deductive is you start with a theory or hypothesis. You do an observation to find out whether or not you find support for or against that hypothesis. That's what I'll be wanting you to do this term, because we have this hypothesis, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and we're going to come up with a way to test it. Inductive would be where you're observing something, you're watching something, and you come up with a theory or observation about what you see. I'm sure you do this all the time in everyday life, or lots of you do, just because you watch what happens in society, and you watch, maybe play a trick on your friends or something, and you watch what happens, or you just watch and you see what's going on, and then you predict patterns. So the most common methods in the social sciences we do on unobtrusive, and you can see there a list. We could look at analyzing statistics that are out there already. I do research like this with homicide. We could do content analysis. I've done a lot of this kind of research. I'll give you some examples of that. We could do experiments. We've been hearing a lot about experiments with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis this term. Qualitative field research, this is things like ethnography, interviewing people, observing people. And then there's surveys, and social scientists, which is, again, what I am. We do a lot of surveys. We didn't, as a group, political scientists who do a lot of research on predicting what's going to happen during elections haven't been doing very well, both in our countries and other countries, with their surveys. One of the key things with surveys is making sure you have a good representative population when you do surveys. But I'll move on. So I'm going to go through each example, give you one example of each. The first is unobtrusive research. In most cases, I'm going to give the example I know a little bit about. That way, if you have questions later, I can tell you more details about them. But also, it's something I know about, and I think it shows you that people right here at this university are doing this kind of work. So the first example is using existing documents. And this was Lori Scott's honors thesis, and I have that GRU written there, and that's because she was actually at Augusta State at the time. I didn't update this slide, sorry about that, but Lori Scott was doing her honors thesis at Augusta State, and she looked at all homicide files of all known cases where women had committed a homicide in either Burke, Columbia, or Richmond counties in Georgia during the 1990s. Now, she stopped on September 20. Her data only goes to September 24th because that's when she actually started doing the research. But we were really lucky. She was able to access all those files. Victims' assistants really helped out there, and then the rest of the people down at the county courthouse and everything was really, really helpful for her. So what did she find? Hopefully you're on a bigger screen, or you can get to a bigger screen to look at this if you're really interested. But I'll just show you just one of the things she found. But overall, she found women who were poorer were more likely to be involved in homicide, and that's because, as she concluded, it was because it was a lot harder to find ways out of situations where homicide might happen, like in domestic violence situations, but also it was more likely they found themselves in horrible situations, often because of economic situations. Again, those were her conclusions. But one of the things I show on the slide is who women were killing. I think that's kind of interesting. This is typical of what happens in the rest of the United States. We see that women are more likely to kill people they're involved in an intimate partner homicide, intimate partner relationships. We see that 31% of the people they killed were intimates, although the largest group would be, in this case, was other known. It depends on, how you categorize this, where we see the largest, but a lot of the people that women kill end up being the people that supposedly they are in love with or have loved in their lives. But we also see that women also killed other family members, offspring, unfortunately their own babies, our own kids in some situations, parents or step-parents, one case a niece. And then 6 of them had killed acquaintances, one had killed somebody they were babysitting, 2 killed a business partner or a dealer. A dealer would be a drug dealer in this case. 4 times they killed somebody who was in a love triangle, so somebody who was dating the man that they were dating. So you can see that data, just what she found by looking at that research, looking at the documents that were existing, so studying existing documents. She had a lot of other things she found, but I won't go into that. So unobtrusive. Another example would be content analysis. Now, content analysis is essentially when you're watching something or reading something and you're counting. You're counting or making observations of a content of something. Now, this could be something, I don't want to go too far into heroes, but think about how many, if we went into superheroes, how many of the superheroes are male, how many are female? That could be a really fun study you guys could get into if you like to look at superheroes. But myself and Lorraine Evans studied women as police officers on television and women as police officers in real life, and we compared essentially, does it seem like there's more women police officers in real life or on television? And that's basically what that screen says. I'll give you a second to read the screen. I pause for a drink here. We did also pay attention to race, but I think I'm mostly going to talk about just the gender representations today. So what I looked at, or what we looked at, was the 1,315 regular characters who were on television programs. So basically anybody who was one of the stars of a television program. So if you turned on your regular show, if you watched CSI Miami or NYPD Blue, or I should come up with a more common show, Criminal Minds, maybe is one that you've watched. And those people who are listed in the credits, those actors, whatever characters they're playing, we looked at those characters. And we recorded the race and the sex of all the characters, and what you see here, and over the years that they've been on television. And what you see here in the pink is the number of women who were represented, the percentage of women police officers as percentage of all officers on television. You see women increased as percentage of officers on television from the 1950s to 2007 when we did this study. So it's a 10-year-old study. And then if you look at the blue line at the bottom, that's women who were real officers, the percent of the sworn officers in large U.S. cities. You can see that increased over time too. But if you were to believe television, there's a lot more women police officers in the world of fiction television than there are in the reality world of policing. We just thought that was kind of an interesting observation. But more than it is interesting, what does it tell young women and young men about who they're going to be working with, what to expect in society? Kind of, you know, if we're basing our thoughts of reality on what we see on television, what are we thinking about the world? And then we show up at our jobs and the world is really different, is kind of what we were looking at, or what we talked about in our article. So we also do experimental research, and it's important to know all studies are not experiments. I don't want you saying we did an experiment unless you really do experiment. Experiments are only one type of study or way to do research. And in social science, experiments are more rare. They are really popular, and they're more, I don't want to say relevant, but they're more likely to occur in psychology than in sociology and in some other fields. Anthropology doesn't have experiments, but it may be that it could. We've been reading a lot about them in the safer warp hypothesis, and that certainly fits with linguistics and with communication, so certainly there are some in those fields. So here's one field, here's one experiment that happened in social science, and it was the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, and it was long before lots of you were born, but it's going to explain why you in your life see people being arrested for domestic violence. That didn't happen when I was a kid. That didn't happen when some of your parents were kids, and it didn't happen because we didn't think of domestic violence as something that was a matter for the public. We thought of it as a personal issue, not a public issue. But some mostly feminist type researchers, feminists, argued that it was important to consider that a public issue. And there were researchers, criminologists in particular, who asked the question, does arresting a man who batters his wife deter him or keep him from doing future battering? Now, the focus at that time was on men battering, and certainly more of the cases of battering involve men, but there are cases where women are battering men, where women are battering other women, and it's more complicated than we know. But this focus at the time was on, does arresting a man who batters his wife keep him from battering his wife in the future? And the finding was, and they did this experiment where they arrested some men, they didn't arrest other men. Sometimes they sent the men to jail for a short time, sometimes for a longer time. And I won't get into all those details, but basically they found the men who were arrested for domestic violence were less likely to have committed violence against their wife by the second time that they found them in their research. So yes, this experiment showed that arresting did matter, and this was a huge experiment at the time in the social science field. Let's see. Let me talk a little bit about why this is on the screen, the arresting, the domestic violence, just a little bit longer. One of the reasons we don't see these experiments like this so often is because they could be difficult to do. Think about if we wanted to see a social science experiment, if we wanted to see if having divorced parents is good or bad. We can't just make people get divorced. So I just want to point that out, that these experiments are very difficult sometimes in the real world when they're not something, when there's something that really matters in people's lives and that could change people's lives. Okay, so next I'm going to do an observation study. It looks like I skipped a slide. but I'm going to go ahead and keep going. And this is an observation, and so I'm moving on to the next kind. And I had these hypotheses when I was in college myself, and I had these ideas that when men and women were together at a car wash, men would be more likely to wash vehicles than females, and when men and women were together, men would be more likely to drive a car than would females. So I'm talking about these car washes where people can go and they pull out that, you know, that spray wand thing, and they spray cars and wash them. So I worked at one of those, and I kind of had some ideas, but I was curious, and I had to do a study of men and women's behavior for a class. So I hypothesized these things about men driving and women driving, and I kind of built it on the idea that women do more of the house cleaning, and I thought that men do more of the car cleaning. So I had these hypotheses. And here's a little bit more about the research. It's a silly little picture of the car I had at the time, and there's an example of a self-service car wash. Tell you that this was way long ago in 1986. Can't believe it was that long ago, but long before you were all born. 30 years ago, I spent over 8 hours in the field watching people. Now, I think this isn't a study we could still do, because I'm curious, do men and women wash cars in the same way? Of course, we have different ways we wash cars even today, but this is something that was really popular, in particular up north. You see, it's January. We did this, but at that time, there was all the snow and the sleet on the ground, and there'd be salt on the ground to keep the snow and the sleet melted, and that really messes up your car. So lots of people would go to the car washes often, and because of that, it was a great place to sit and watch people. So here's all my data, probably too much data than you need to know, but 12 times men came together, and 10 times the men helped each other. Only 2 times did the passenger stay in the car. 2 times women came together. 1 time the woman waited in the car, and the other time the woman got out to help. There was 1 time that there was, there's a little, you can't read what that is supposed to be, but there was 1 woman driver and 1 male passenger, and the passenger stayed in the car, and that was so unusual that I was just curious and looked for a handicap spot on the car indication, because it was just so unusual that happened, because it's so rare that a woman would be driving a car with a man passenger. I should have concluded on that page about the cars, but basically it was what I found, what I predicted, is when men were more likely to drive and men were more likely to wash the car when men and women were together. Okay. The other observation I did was a crack bust, and please ride along. I drove around with a police officer. She was fairly new. She'd been a rookie and had just been on her own for about 6 months. And this was an overt study where people knew I was watching, at least the police did. And basically, if I showed up at a house, like we showed up at a situation for domestic violence, and when I went in the house, they said, you know, I was observing, and so nobody's really paying attention to me anyways. But we did manage to, before the night was over, bust somebody for crack. But the thing that was so amazing on this night was this was a while ago. This was the 1990s, and I'm sure you've heard about police and whether or not they look for certain races, and you probably hear they look for African Americans. Well, we were driving around in a poor African American neighborhood, and that's a Columbus police car you see on the front. I was in Columbus, Ohio at the time. I got in the car with the police officer. We got something to drink and eat, and then we went driving around this neighborhood, a poor African American neighborhood. And she told me, look for white people. And I said, what? And she said, look for white people. Now, granted, she knew I was there to watch, but she still said, I want you to look for white people. And I said, well, why? And she said, because if white people are here, they're buying crack. And I found this extremely problematic. I said, well, couldn't white people be here because their friends live here, because they live here, because their family live here? And she said, nope, if they're here, they're buying crack. So we drove around and we pulled over a car full of white people and African American people. It was a mixed people. Woohoo! People are together. I could have told her that. But anyways, first group we pulled over with some white people in the car, and they were there. There was this family, and they were taking some of their kids back. It was actually a mixed family, and they were going back to their house. The next group we pulled over, it was we pulled over a white guy, and he was taking his kids back to his ex-wife's house. Of course, the next person we pulled over, it was actually a white guy. He was by himself, and he was in the African American neighborhood buying crack. So she, she ended up being right on 1 out of 3 occasions. So interesting night. See my observations, see what I saw, and basically I concluded, yes, the police were profiling. So one more way we do research surveys. It's very common for social scientists. We ask people simply, do you do this? What do you do? What is your behavior? What do you think about this? My one example for you is one by Don McCabe, not one I've done myself, but on college cheating in the 90s. And they can continue to do these kind of studies, and they're kind of curious, why do students cheat and what occasions do they cheat? Excuse me, in some cases they even ask why they cheat. Now this was sent out to highly selective colleges, so not at our level but higher, like schools like Harvard's. And they got about 40% of the people that they sent these out to respond, which is really good response rate. They found out that 67% of the students, or 67.4%, had cheated on a test or major assignment at least once in their college career. And you can see the reasons there. And we figure this is kind of interesting and good for college professors to know. The pressure to get good grades plays in, excessive workloads plays in. At least this is what the students tells us. They don't believe it causes any harm, or they thought the teachers weren't teaching or weren't reasonable. So this all ties into what we talk about in social sciences, and particularly in criminal justice, as Sykes and Matz's techniques of neutralization. The idea that people know things are wrong, but they come up with a legitimate, or what they believe is a legitimate excuse to do this cheating. So let me just say, I reviewed very quickly, but you can listen to this again, you can look at it again. I'll put this up both as a PowerPoint, and I'll put it up as a lecture to listen to, so you can look at both the notes, so you can look at it as a PowerPoint, and you can listen to the lecture. But overall, so you can see the different kinds of research we can do. We're going to tie this in class into ways we could do our research. So be thinking about how we could do these different kinds of research to study the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. To think about, is there a way we could do it with an observational study? Is there a way we could do it with something like a content analysis? Think about those kind of things. So there's going to be a quiz on D2L. This is how you'll get credit for watching this slideshow. There'll be or participation points for 120, because we're not going to be in class. It's very short and to the point. I think I'm going to do 3 questions. I haven't written it yet, but I'm thinking I'm going to ask for an example from the lecture. And it is open book, open notes, so feel free to have the lecture notes open. And don't forget to turn in your article review form on 126 and do the best that you can on that. As I told you in class, I understand some of you don't know all the methods and things for what the articles you find, but again, do the best you can. And I'll see you on the 27th. Thanks for listening. That's all.